Welcome back to episode 2.
Lock it, snap it, break it off. Figure out the meaning of that at the
end. First topic on the chopping block. Oh, we should say thanks to everyone who's already watched and chatted to us about what we said in our last podcast. So
feedback is appreciated. Keep it coming. It's good stuff.
First topic is differences between cities. MTV cities.
Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. Where should we start? Let's go from east to west.
Sure.
So I guess I'll take the lead. Being born there, then living in Toronto second, and then living in Vancouver third. Spending a good amount of time between the three. I guess I could start by highlighting the positives about Montreal, and then I'll go into the negatives, and then maybe we'll go through the positives and negatives of each one, and then we'll compare all of that between the three eventually at the end. Montreal, cheaper to live in, but you get what you pay for. Straight facts. It has a warm feeling to it of a young city, but that vibrance is probably more useful in your mid-20s versus your mid-30s, probably. And if you're the type of person who likes to party, hang out with your friends, have a good time on a cheap dollar, it's good. It's fun. Food is varied. Culturally, it's very diverse, which I appreciate. And I feel like there, to touch on the current climate of the world, there's so many fair amounts of other that it's hard for the white population to be oblivious to the issues. Not to say that they aren't still perpetuating some of the issues, or there is an institutional racism in Quebec, because there very much is. It's probably the south of Canada. Even Alberta would love to take that title, but they don't do it naturally. They just try. But it's very hard to encounter white people who haven't been around minorities, cultured around them, raised around them, understand them a bit better, even though they still have their permafrost levels of ignorance that even your best of friends can have. But it's not out of malice, just out of they're also victims of the patriarchy at the same time. But yeah, Montreal has a lot of positives for a young, cheap lifestyle that can be fun and fully cultured. And I think it's the only city in Canada that can really lay claim to being truly Canadian if we really want to say we are a bilingual country. It's the only city that really lives out that creed, whether they do it forcefully or not. You want to start with Toronto?
Well, no, I have an opinion on Montreal.
Okay, that's
don't
fair.
I?
That's fair. You've lived there for a bit. Maxie.
Let me see. I would say that the actual city of Montreal is definitely diverse. So I'm able to visibly see every different color within a 50-foot radius or 100-foot radius. I can say that. The suburbs of Montreal, not so much.
They'll say none on the West Island.
It's pretty polarized, like where you live, where you own a home.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty polarized between blacks and whites, I would say, in most of the suburbs that I've been to. I'm sure there are other areas that have Asians in them, as I know friends.
What about St. Charles? It was popping. It was popping for you, know? That Mr. Spicy down the road.
That was one Chinese place in the middle of nowhere.
In the West Island. That was, all things considered, it was the West Island.
Fair enough. Also, the Chinese food in the suburbs of maybe apart from the downtown Montreal, it's not so good. It's not Chinese. It's it's different. I don't even know how to really describe it, but it's definitely not my favorite.
That's fair. Mr. Spicy.
It was good though. It was good, but I wouldn't call that necessarily it's Asian inspired.
And even though this isn't for most of my true LaSalle peeps, not all of them, some of y'all aren't grateful.
Probably gonna talk about the
Listen,
buffet
buffet Chinois
chinois
Mandarin, that shit
mandarin.
fucking
So
slaps.
I went
Okay,
there
the
because
wontons ain't got no meat in them. It's
he's
pure
been
fucking dough, but it
he's been
slaps.
talking about this place for
Mm-hmm. I was
ages.
born and raised on that shit,
And
me.
he's like, "Oh, let me take you to the buffet chinois
And it took
mandarin."
2 hours by public transit
It took two
because
hours by public
everything's under
transit,
construction in
and I was like,
Montreal. So
"Sweet." I took 2 hours to get to a quote
in the rain,
unquote in the rain to get to a Chinese buffet, and they have pizza and pasta
yeah,
and
Jello, ice cream,
random things.
chicken wangs,
They
bangs.
I think I took a picture and I posted on Instagram going like, I'm at a Chinese buffet. And there was really nothing super Chinese about it other than like the super nice
The
Chinese
sparrows.
owner who was like, "Oh, hello, finally I see you."
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. The spare ribs is nice. The beef and broccoli is nice. The French fries is nice. The chicken wings is nice.
French
The
fries.
fried rice
I
is
think
nice.
they had tater tots.
So
They had
the beef is nice, whatever way it's prepared.
but I do think it was a real eye opener in terms of like what Asian cuisine, how it's represented in places where the demographic is not predominantly Asian.
Yes.
So I was like, huh, I'm blessed. I never want to leave Vancouver and its Asian delights ever again. And I'm okay
Don't
to
let
say
it hurt
that.
your feelings, buffet Chinois Mandarin. You still fucking slay, yeah.
I ate there though. I ate all those things. I ate all those things, and I appreciate. I didn't get a stomach ache, so that's good. But that's what I would say about Montreal. It's pretty diverse on the island. I'd say like in terms of the French speaking because I'm not bilingual.
We don't go to the east side. Sorry, folks, but we ain't got nothing here. Fuck that side.
In the West Island, it was easier, definitely easier than some of the experience that I've had going like, let's say into like further east.
Going to Lloyd's and all that.
Like if I'm at the what's the mall called? Fairview.
Fairview, that's in the West Island, yeah.
If I'm there, I feel just fine. Like nobody kind of treats me shitty because I can't speak French.
Yeah.
And for the most part, the bus drivers in the West Island have been super nice when I try to speak French to them. And even then, they're like, "No, we know, but thank you." And then they like go.
I have something to point out. This is kind of dipping into the negatives, though, of Montreal, which is hard to avoid the slippery slope. But I think something to point out, a lot of people don't realize about Montreal, even though there is racial injustice, like banning religious symbols, telling Middle Eastern women that they can't wear clothing of their choice, stuff like that, telling people that they can't speak English when they work in a store, they greet people, endless list of things. But the bigger dividing line in Montreal, or that I should say the biggest one, is language. Like I could get on a bus and encounter an Anglophone white bus driver who's going to speak in French, but you could tell who's Anglophone and who isn't, and they'll be the sweetest person to me. But if I encounter a black French person, Haitian, and an African who's a French, who's been colonized by the French versus me being colonized by the English, there's this immediate instinctive defense of the Frenchness versus, even though it's between two black people. And I think that's one of the things that stands out about Montreal the most. They judge you by your language first. They still hate you for your color, but they'll take you on their side if you can promote their French agenda. That's very, very noticeable, and something I had forgotten but was reintroduced to when I refused to waver in my Anglophone speech to French black bus drivers. They did not like me.
But in Toronto, the bus drivers don't really care.
They just don't interact.
They don't.
If you pay, they don't care. If you stink, they don't care. Just keep it going.
Yep.
Keep it going. Capitalism.
I will say that Toronto is also pretty diverse, especially because we live pretty much downtown, and it's pretty obvious that
everyone's here.
Yeah, like we'll go to the grocery store and there's at least one of every single one. You know, at least.
It feels more like the diversity here feels more united versus in Montreal it seems equally apparent, but people are already, they come with their preconceived notions of what you're going to be like towards them, like, and it's more ingrained because there are more variables of disdain to be factored in.
All the same cultures and ethnicities exist in both places, but in Montreal they're a little bit more siloed, where here people tend to intermingle a little
Yeah.
bit more, and they have less of those preconceived notions. They're a little bit more open to not having them to begin with,
Yeah.
which is what I like, which is why I wanted to move here, because
Mhm.
the diversity was obvious. Um, and also diversity is reflected in food, and that's the main driver of wanting to come here. Is like I
Mhm.
didn't feel finished in terms of exploring not just the food, like not just the diversity in the cuisine, but the diversity in everything you can do because of the cultures that exist here.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, what are some of the negatives of Toronto that you noticed?
Oh, it's not a pretty sight.
Yeah,
Not
it's
for
not very
me.
nice looking.
Not for me, man. I mean, we talked about this last time with the lake, and there, I guess if you really are in love with the way a city looks,
Yeah.
you could be like, yeah, there's like beautiful art on buildings. There's a really interesting like juxtaposition between very old architecture and very new
It's not
architecture.
all uniform.
It's not uniform. It's interesting. Like it is cultural, and it is interesting, and it is everything that people say about Canada. Essentially, it's a nice poster child for Canada.
It's a good representation. But I will say, when they do move forward with that plan to show up Quebec for being assholes and making things in bilingual, putting assisting people in both official languages in public transit, I think that's when it'll officially
Be
nullify Montreal's purpose
yeah,
in a weird
and I
way.
respect that. I do respect that Ontario is trying to really uphold that sense of bilingualism, because I think if more provinces other than Quebec were doing that, we would be a truly bilingual country. Not just in the first like few years of your grade school, but carried on into your adulthood, and it would be really prominent that bilingualism gives you an advantage as a worker, gives you an advantage in government jobs and stuff like that. So I think that's a really good move on Ontario's part.
I'd say, I don't know where the quote comes from, but you have a better chance of getting somebody to take their jacket off if you make the room warmer versus telling them to take it off. And Canada doesn't realize that, yes, Quebec is stubborn and they could be an asshole, but their reasons are valid. They're protecting themselves against a system that dehumanized them in many ways when the English came over and recolonized North America and took it from them and made them basically three-fifths in many ways. So part of me sincerely empathizes with their need to, like, you know what, fuck you, I'm not doing your thing. This is mine. It's mine, my culture, my way. I don't care if it hurts me, as long as it hurts you. It's very self-serving and it's very insecure, but it comes from a place of sincere fear. And I think when people always say, I can't get service in English in Montreal, but then flip side is all those Canadians that are in Quebec, if they go to Alberta and they ask a police officer to help them and they speak French, they're as good as dead. That's equally not fair. So I understand both sides of the argument, and I think Toronto could take the lead if they are the country's leader in many ways. If they take the lead and make that example, it's the gesture that's been needed for a long time that people have ignored as if it wasn't a real problem. You solve Canada's linguistic issues by actually treating both languages fairly, not just in legislation but in practice.
Agreed.
Vancouver, you should leave.
Vancouver. Well, what can I say? Vancouver is two colors, white and yellow.
I'd say it's three. It's like 40% white, it's like 35% yellow, and then it's 25% brown.
Yeah, that's
Everything else
definitely
doesn't
true.
matter.
But then you could say it's polarized between white and Asian.
Yes. Yeah.
And the continent of Asia.
Yes.
I definitely am aware of the polarization, and I'm aware that it's not as diverse as people claim it to be. I think when people are like, "Oh, Vancouver is such a multicultural city," it can be if you find one of each, and it's just going to be one of each.
You get that lucky moment
when you find the tokens
like, hey,
of
wait,
all.
Wait, we're all here.
But I will say that it's become much more culturally diverse.
Yeah. Each year it gets more and more.
Since 2010. So since the Olympics, that's kind of when Vancouver popped off and was like, okay, people saw that Vancouver could be a place where they could live, and they came over to try it.
Yeah.
And I think that's when we started to see a lot of racial tensions, because there was this influx of different races and different cultures. And I think it was a good thing. I think it is a good thing for the city to be uncomfortable and to really check
Forces it
itself.
to grow.
It forces the people who live there and who are from there to really think about that statement. Oh, Vancouver is such a diverse city. Is it? Once you
Yeah.
see the influx of the diversity that you thought you had, you can compare. No, it wasn't. It
Yeah.
really wasn't before. And I
But
think that's an important thing to for Vancouverites who are born and raised, which are quite rare in that city. You don't find a lot of Vancouverites who are born and raised in the city. They might be from Surrey. No offense, that's not
hey there,
Vancouver
buddy.
City. But there's not a lot of people who are from there. There's a lot of immigrants.
I'd say being one of the arrivals after the Olympics, I felt like the Olympics as a Central Canadian, when we saw that, we were equally learning about it like the rest of the world. When they were like, "So that's Canada," and we're like, "I guess that's what it looks like over there. I guess the new immigrants go there." Like that's what, as a Central Canadian, where we had generations of everything. All I saw from my ignorant perspective was that's a lot of brown and yellow immigrant children on TV waving flags. That's what it looked like, if I'm being honest. I was like, but it looks very, very nice and harmonious. I like it. I'm going. It's kind of like the Y2J countdown, like Raw is Jericho. It's probably playing over your head, so it's okay. Raw is Jericho. So instead of being like Raw is Jericho, it was like Vancouver is Craigwell. No. No.
No.
Mm.
Anyways, so out of the three cities, which do you prefer?
So I'll rank them in order of 1, 2, 3 of preference, 1 being first, 3 being last. For me, it'll be Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, but it really should be Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. But for me, home is where home is, and certain things that I can't replace anywhere else. So Montreal comes second. But if I'm unbiased, you could do more in Toronto. So Toronto second. But Vancouver is just, you don't need to spend money to enjoy where you are, which kind of rationalizes the high cost of living, because it's priceless to have good quality air, good quality water, natural scenery, natural parks, infrastructure that can allow you to play hockey for $15 a night, where like things are run well, things are appreciated, things are maintained, things are well structured, things operate how they should. Except you guys need to get a highway through the city. That's about it.
Yeah, I would go Vancouver number one, Toronto number two, Montreal number three. But if you were to put them on like a linear measurement, Vancouver would be quite ahead of the pack.
Yes.
For me personally, not just because I grew up there, but because it just matches everything that I do. Like I'm not, as I think we mentioned this in the last video, I'm not a nightlife person, I'm not a party goer, I'm not super social. I like to do things outside, and I like to, but I mean, I like to do things outside, as in go and sit by the water or sit at the beach or something like that. But the other cities, I think what people really like about them is not a priority for me for my enjoyment.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the rich culture in Toronto a lot, and I was saying this to some coworkers, like the happy medium for me would be to take the city of Toronto and it's
drop it in the mountain cradle of
drop
Vancouver.
it like right in the middle of Vancouver, and not so much the look or whatever that is, but it's more so the vibe, like the vibe of the Toronto city. I'm a city person, and if it was right in the center and I could have the ocean there and the mountains there, and then take the bilingualism of and pride of Quebec and put that into Vancouver, that would be the perfect place for me, because I need to live by the ocean.
So I guess that's pretty much it for MTV.
Yeah.
Who cares about Calgary?
The Stampeders.
Oh, that's where I thought we were going to cut it.
Anyways, next topic.
Mm-hmm.
The next topic is pressure on white people to say something in these times.
I've been see, I'm torn about what to expect from people, because I always believe you should expect nothing from people. But I think when you have friends and family, you have a higher threshold of expectation, hence why they are friends and family, because you would do more for them and vice versa, and you might expect the same. But at the same time, I still can understand it can be hard to be told to speak on a topic when you have no sincere desire, not because you don't care. Well, it is because you don't care, but it's that, as Ronnie Chang says, you have no skin in the game. No skin in the game.
Oh my gosh, he quoted an Asian
Hey, it's
Canadian.
true. But that being said, at this very moment, Ronnie Chang himself is one of the ones who's prophesizing about yellow peril, black power, or black pride, whatever the statement is, or showing examples of how the Asian American experience is actually affected by how the black experience is a narrative to the white experience, where immigrants were introduced to the country of America knowing that we will let you have somewhat of the American dream as long as you're slightly above the blacks, but not above us. And that gave the illusion to many immigrants that blacks could not do what they did, which seemed equally hard. And that's where I can understand the no skin in the game. But I think if you have a sincere care for the condition of your friends and family, you do have skin in the game, because their skin should be your skin in some ways.
Well, I definitely think that that is the point of contention for a lot of white people, is that they don't see people of color as their family. Like, if you grow up, and I think this is a result of environmental ignorance, where if you grow up in a space where it's all white people and you're a white person, you don't interact with colors, you work in a job, maybe you see colored people on TV or in ads or whatever, but you generally do not interact with people other than white people, it's not going to be surprising what your reaction is to something like.
You become sensitized or resensitized.
Yeah.
No, sorry, desensitized or re-desensitized to the fact of other.
Yeah, and I also think that it's, for white people, poor white people these days,
getting called out by name.
Ooh,
it hurt.
They're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And no, like, for me, I'm kind of sitting here laughing because you kind of deserve it.
No skin in the game.
You kind of deserve it, but the truth is, if a white person who grows up ignorant because of their environment tries to then speak out, they're met sometimes with like, oh, what do you have
Where have you been?
Yeah, and everybody has a journey at which point they realize, oh shit, I am ignorant. Like, they get their aha moment.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like we should be chastising other people for when that moment happens.
I think it's very obvious when your white friends or people who just might not understand the systemic racism, when they have their aha moment, you can tell when it's sincere.
Yeah.
Like, I find with all this, a lot of people, like, I'm playing Warzone Call of Duty, and it's like 3 a.m. and all I see on my screen is Black Lives Matter. We here at Warzone. Sometimes you're like, is that you're doing the bare minimum, or is that a sincere statement? And it's hard to tell sometimes, but then the other side of it is, like, I had a friend of mine who I met when I moved to Vancouver, and I think he and his brother would be very, could back this up, that I would use my race card, but not in a malicious way, but I would always point out things in a racial manner that probably made them uncomfortable and that they probably thought was not necessary, but they always respected the way that I brought my point across, and they gave me the time to at least engage with the thought, whether they agreed or not, whether or not it changed them. They at least respected that I was speaking, and I appreciated that. And I'd always tell them like, yeah, you're getting white boy wasted. I can't get down with that. Yeah, you're in a state where when you go, woo, to you, that's a good time. To black people, that's generations of, that white man is unhinged. He might harm me because he does not care. I'm not as valuable. I'm seen as less than a person. Kind of the way how a lot of white privilege is internalized, and people say that they don't have it, but that example of the woman in the park who decided to weaponize her whiteness and weaponize that man's blackness, saying, I'm going to call the cops on you, black man. I'm a white woman. She didn't even need to think about it. She knew where her power laid and where his did not.
Yeah.
And a lot, like, I had a friend who said, sincerely, I'm thankful for meeting you. You've made me look at my own country in a different way, and I'm thankful for it. And he's somebody who I blatantly would tell him to his face is you're extremely white, and there's certain things that we just can't share. And that took a lot of him to even reach out to me and say that. So I thank him. I appreciate the fact that when I speak, it's not falling on deaf ears, and that to me is a sign of somebody who's an actual ally and wants to, whether it's not to their benefit, they're willing to hear what's for your benefit.
I think that on the other side of it, there's a lot of pressure on white people to speak up, but I think specifically white celebrities or people who have significant platforms, because at this point, very little people want to listen to white people, and
Yeah.
but I do think that there's pressure on white people to speak to white people, one, or pressure on white people to show face, like to say yes, I'm even, I'm, even though I'm quiet, I still care about this. And I don't know how I feel about that. I don't think that, I think the pressuring, like media pressuring or fans pressuring a certain celebrity or certain person in popular,
Pressure is not good.
I don't think, I think it just brings out inauthenticity.
Contrived statement.
Yeah, it's contrived, it's not authentic. And then at the same time, if you would have just let that person do whatever he or she does, whatever they want to do, that's their true colors. Don't you want to see that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Versus pressuring white people into saying things that maybe they don't even want to say or they don't feel. And then it becomes a facade, like the whole thing with Drew Brees.
Yeah.
Did he really want to apologize?
Keep that same energy. Like I have a quote unquote family who they are in relations with military, and we're all for the stance of do not kneel. That's disrespectful to the vets and everything. And in my mind, I was always perplexed whenever I would see people with my skin color not sincerely understand what the whole point is. It's like you've either bought into a narrative, you are easily bought and don't know what a narrative is, or you are a sellout. But
or secret door number 3, you're just unwilling to listen. Like you haven't actually listened.
But for me, the reason why I don't feel the need to have that person listen is because it is about them. They should know. They like if you're a black person, you should not need to be educated on what racial profiling is. If you've lived that life where you've never felt it or seen it, either you are a unicorn, you are very, very lucky, or you are oblivious. Because it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. So all the people who are like, police brutality is bad, but don't disrespect the flag. You people were the same people who say now, like, I love Muhammad Ali, peaceful protests, I love Martin Luther King, but when they were out, you would have been the people saying what you're saying when Colin Kaepernick was saying this is an issue. You would have been like, can you stop? I just want to watch football. You are that person. If that's what you're doing now, you're that person then. And if you've seen that person back then as somebody who was hurting the efforts to alleviate racism and in a way perpetuating and re-entrenching racism, the sad truth is you are them. It'll just take time for you to realize that you were there.
And then that's, I guess, not in the same vein, but on the side of the white people, I would just say that I don't think we should be pressuring anybody to say something. I think it has to be authentic, and
yes.
that pressure is not sustainable. It's like forcing somebody to change. We can't change people. I cannot change that person sitting across the way. Like I cannot, but I can do what I can to either speak by example, lead by example, open a conversation, whatever that is. But I inherently I'm not speaking to them to change them.
I'm much better off with dead silence versus contrived statements, but dead silence is still also a statement. I think that needs to be said. It's still a statement. It might not be a clear statement, but it's saying that you don't know what to say or you don't want to say something. But it's still a statement. It's just not an overt statement.
I think there's a, I don't know who the quote is by, but maybe you do. Can't remember it right now. But it's if you've chosen
You've
silence.
chosen the side of the oppressor. I'm not certain who said it, but yeah, silence in many ways. Like silence and action is still action, but silence and inaction is maintaining the status quo.
That's where I differentiate because I don't necessarily think that silence is necessarily the side of the oppression of the oppressor if it's not coupled with your own action. If you stay silent and you make silent moves but you're still moving, I think
If you're
that's
Anya, if you're Anya, if
that's
you're on
Anya.
your lasagna grain, if you're on your lasagna grind.
Might have to edit that.
No. You keep that natural. It's all good. I
What's a
can't speak.
lasagna grind?
Even silence like lasagna. Come on,
Where's that from?
Jay-Z.
How is lasagna silent? I don't get it.
Even silence like lasagna.
Anyways, do you have anything else to say on this before we move on?
Uh, I'd say. Oh, one last thing. If the conversations you're having as a white person are only with other white people, it means you're afraid of sharing what you think.
I think that's true. I think at this point,
If you're talking about it, but not to the people who it's about, you're afraid of your own self.
I think at this point, it's important for white people to try and be brave enough to admit their ignorance and they're racist. Be overt if that's what you are. If that's authentic, I can at least be like, okay, that person's being honest.
Yep.
I can move along from them. But it's not a time to have
No
those
pussyfooting.
dishonest or contrived statements because no one's going to listen.
No
People will
pussyfooting.
listen if you are overtly racist, but at least, at the very least, you can be like, well, that's all I kind of grew up with. So I think that that's the only thing that white people
Keep
really
it
need
real.
to do. White people just need to face their own selves.
Yeah, and not in the closet. Want to bring it back home and make it more centralized to the Canadian experience?
Sure.
Uh, our racism gets misunderstood by many people in the South and many people here as well because we kind of overlap it with what the experience is in the States. It's similar, but it's different because our racial composition in Canada and our national creed of being a multicultural place versus a melting pot creates different realities about that dichotomy because you're always going against, in the States, you're always going against the old stock, which everybody's trying to assimilate into, versus you're still not there into the old stock. Whereas in Canada, you're adding to a tapestry. And I think that's where in the States, if somebody says you people, like somebody like a Charlemagne will misconstrue that as black people, but up here in Canada, that means immigrant, plain and simple. And to, I guess, touch on Don Cherry, I think it's a good time to reflect on what transpired with Don Cherry because it touched Canada in a way that was uniquely Canadian, and it made a lot of it had some white people realize the dog whistle nature of the you people. It made some white people reconsolidate behind him because show love for the vets by a poppy valid statement. It showed what their priorities were, and not necessarily that people really understood what he was saying, but what they got from it, they were defending that, not necessarily every aspect of what he was saying. And we lost focus of the overall point of why there was contention with the you people. Not that buying poppies is bad and trying to get people to do that is bad, but when you say you people who come here for our milk and honey, I think that's very hard to misunderstand. He's talking about people who arrive, i.e., immigrants, and only come to take what they want, but then don't partake in what he deems necessary. And for the people on the colored side who defended his narrative of you people, I think they misunderstand or they're not aware of the fact that when you're the you people that behave how the system likes, you're not a threat. You're you're the you're the Samuel L. Jackson in Django. You help his life. You put the other coloreds in line for them. Whereas if you were to step out of line, you would realize how quickly you weren't as valuable, and that you people would become a damning term to you versus a haha, he's just saying all of us. And I think that gets lost on people of color who fit the quote unquote Canadian white narrative very seamlessly. They don't realize that they're still you people. Long rant.
Yeah.
Long rant.
I was like, okay, it's gonna be his segment.
No, no. Go on, good.
I guess I agree, but I think the Canadian narrative of racism is too often blanket statemented, if I can use that as a term, to most Canadians. So you'll see racial injustice in America and you'll go, oh, those Americans, blah, blah, blah. And then the initial reaction to that is always, well, it happens in Canada too, and we just don't talk about it, but it's here. I think that that's obvious, one. Two, a cop out to be like, Canada's not perfect, but let's talk about why Canada's not perfect. Let's not talk about it in a comparative sense.
Yeah,
let's talk about it just in a Canadian context. What is the Canadian experience of an immigrant? What's the Canadian experience as an Asian Canadian, as a Caribbean Canadian or African Canadian? All of these pieces of culture versus just blanket statementing
the American narrative.
Yeah, like, oh, it's so shitty. Like during this whole time, I've been trying to find like an exhaustive list of strictly Canadian resources that Canadians can contribute to, that are Canadian organizations, Black-led, Black businesses to contribute in this time, because everybody keeps posting American ones.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's great. I'm not saying don't sign those petitions or text 55 whatever to George Floyd, whatever. It's not about that. It's about, okay, if I donate to the NAACP, okay, or if I sign a petition for Breonna Taylor, whatever that is, I think that's her name.
I think so.
I understand that it's a greater purpose to collect and to unify and solidify everybody's movement towards getting justice for these lives and the American narrative. But I feel like if we want to talk about Canadian narratives around race, we also need to understand what are the injustices in Canada, not just the American ones, and where can we support in Canadian locales? Because every resource that's floating around, and I predominantly follow Canadians on Instagram, on social media, my family, everybody is posting American resources.
Yeah.
And for me, that's a problem, because it's easy for us to say, oh, those Americans are like this, but it happens in Canada too. And yet you contribute to American initiatives.
Yeah.
What about Canadian initiatives?
What about Africville in Nova Scotia? Generations of systemic oppression. And then the Asian Americans who built the Canadian railroads and were jailed for using opium, which was a common vice for them in their native lands. The same way that African Americans, Caribbean Canadians are vilified for the use of marijuana. The system attacks the things that can dehumanize you. But we don't talk about the Canadian experiences. And first and foremost, if on the totem pole of racial inequality, the blacks are at the bottom of it in the States, we have to address the fact that natives get fucked.
Also,
on
after
regular
using the term totem pole.
Yeah.
Whoops.
No, it's not a whoops. It's I am who I am. You might not know where you're insensitive or not.
But I think that your use of that term also speaks to the environment you grew up in.
Yeah, exactly. We are all victims of our environment. Yeah,
which is like in Vancouver, it was very obvious to me growing up, because I was around people who worked with, maybe I didn't have friends in the Indigenous community directly, but I was around people who were working with Indigenous people much more so, and I was more educated on where certain terms come from, not to use the term powwow when you're talking about having a group meeting at work and stuff like that. Like that was stuff that was taught to me younger, because I just knew people around me had those conversations with me.
I sincerely have no knowledge of an issue with the word totem pole. What if you can educate me, what is the issue?
Well, I think the issue is, and this is kind of related to this other topic that we may have talked about, which is where using like a certain term to describe something else, is not quite the analogy, although it's a familiar analogy. Like people tend to use the term totem pole to describe something because that's the case. Yeah. Whereas like it calls into question their actual knowledge of what a totem pole really stands for, or it's just in general its historical roots. So in general, like I'm not super educated on totem poles in general, but people have said to me, if you are unsure about how that affects the communities that you're speaking with, then probably don't use it until you do that research to make sure you understand the the I guess the gravity of what you're saying. The analogy that you're creating, just make sure it's the most accurate.
Do you have any firsthand knowledge of anything that could be incorrect about totem pole and in the way that I had used it?
No.
Okay.
I personally was saying oops just as a, not saying you did something wrong, but as in describing a community, you like we're addressing a community, you might use terms that most people may think, oh, you can't use that term because it's associated with that community, even if it's not a racial term. So it was more of a joke than it was to say that you did something wrong.
Just always trying to be aware.
Yeah.
That is all.
It's just a joke. But
okay. Check your privilege because you never know. You might learn something. You never know.
Well, that's what I was reading today. I was reading like 10 phrases that you didn't know, that you may not have known are rooted in racism. And I was like, oh shit, I never knew all these things. Because they passed over time for so long. Or else I haven't grown up with people who had those conversations with me, or I felt the need to research it.
I had a couple uppity people in my high school. Yeah, I said it.
I don't even know what uppity. Well, explain for the people.
Well, the root was whenever a black person thought that they were on equal footing with a white, but it's been kind of bastardized within the black community, kind of the same way nigger is meant to be an oppressive statement from a white person to a black person, but it was a black person, but it was co-opted within the community to desensitize it. The same way uppity has been, where let's say you encounter a black person who just, their nose is in the air, they act like they're roses, that they shit roses, that they don't have any issues, that they are above, whether they say it overtly or explicitly. Their body language can sometimes imply it. A good example is Whitley from A Different World. She could be described as uppity. She saw privilege, or exerted privilege, through the way that she thought she was perceived by the way that she looked, at least from what looked from my vantage point growing up. There are many of those, but it is a racist term. It was meant to be, but hey, so be it. So be it.
I'm reading about the history of a totem pole.
Nice.
Just to figure it out.
Education.
Well, education. That's usually where it starts. It usually starts with you like saying something and going, is it? I'm not that sure. And then you go and read something about it and you try to figure it out.
I judge people off their intent first and foremost, but if you're educated on a misinformed intent and you refuse to change, then your intent is to be that way.
I don't judge people off their, like, sometimes you can't determine intent very easily, and sometimes it's not worth determining intent. So all I do is just educate myself. Like, that's it. That conversation was like, shit, I kind of really don't know about totem poles. Why did I make that joke? Let's figure it out. That's kind of what you're supposed to do to peel back your own ignorance.
Indeed.
So,
indeed. Can you touch the something else?
Anything else on the narrative of you people?
Let me see here. I think I had a couple notes. Well, since I touched on Martin Luther King and Colin Kaepernick, the other side of the pendulum of black people asking for justice and equality is the Malcolm X approach, which I've always gravitated towards and felt at one with, because it never compromised the integrity of my manhood. It never made me have to question if I was standing up for myself or if I was trying to assist others in standing up for me. Um, Charlemagne brought up something, bring him up again. I was watching him on Colbert where he mentioned that in the 60s, and even before that, all the slave revolts, everything, all the people who stood on the front lines of being the main voices for the black cause were always from the South, and they always led with emotion. And I think when he made that list, it made me realize, it stood out to me that Malcolm was the only Northerner. He was born in Lansing, Michigan. His parents met in Montreal. He was the only Northerner. And I think that's what scared the system most, was the fact that he didn't just have the feeling of the blacks, but he knew how to speak the language of the whites. And for the bones of the cause, like the emotional bones that all the black preachers would speak to, like the foundation, the emotions, the raw emotions of why this is wrong, why it hurts us. He could be pragmatic and speak truth to power in a way where they could not ignore it, because when truth enters your mind, it expands it and it can never contract back. And they feared his ability to reach minds. All the other approaches were to contact emotions, but emotions don't tend to get legislation done.
I
Words,
disagree.
well, no, they spur the action, but Malcolm was able to, his wording, where he would have debates in Oxford when he'd go to the UN. He was able to put meat on those bones as to how to address the issues, what needs to happen, why this is wrong, why I have these rights. He was able to put those in words that it didn't matter if it came from a black man or a white man. Those words were empirical.
And the
Southern approach was always nonviolent. We shall overcome. We shall show them our pain. We shall make them join in our pain. Malcolm was like, fuck it, let's get something done.
interesting.
Let's get something done. They only understand the ballot or the bullet. The ballot or the bullet. They only started listening to Martin when the alternative was like, yeah, we can't do it that way. We got to listen to this side, because we can't go his way, because he wants all of that and what's on your wrist. He wants everything he's owned. Martin just wants equality, which is why later on he said, I fear I led you into a burning house.
Do you think that Malcolm would have that type of approach if he didn't grow up in the South? If he wasn't born in Michigan? Or if he had moved from Michigan to the South early in his life?
Uh, I think the fact that he grew up with whites in a way where he was integrated, he learned them better. Whereas in the South, you were segregated and you saw them from a distance and had fear of them. Malcolm was with them, understood them, and did not fear them. So it gave him a different perspective on how he stood up as a man for his rights. He wasn't begging, he was stating, like, no, this is it. And I think that Northern approach, kind of the same way with music, hip hop music, the structure of East Coast New York music was more so clear speech, make sure they understand my wordplay. The South, it was all feel. It was all feel. The feel will get you eventually, but the words have to be there to really marry the message.
I disagree.
Why?
Because, in the words of Malcolm X, by any means necessary.
Yes.
Which means there's a place for every approach
Yes.
in the common unified fight or the common unified movement. Malcolm's approach was just one way of achieving the same goal. All of the Southerners and the civil rights movement all had a different approach, and even in the West, where people were like mostly associated with hippiness and mostly associated with peace and love and openness, they also had a different approach, which was, that's not an issue here. Even though it still was, generally people felt like from the South, the North was a good way to go, or the West. It's just that the North was closer.
Yeah.
So I disagree in saying that the words matter more. I think it needs to be a marriage of both things. And there's so many layers and variables that affect the way those things interact with each other. So it's almost like you need the perfect storm, the perfect lightning rod to be able to channel both words and emotions and different things. And so I think that neither one approach is better than the other, but I think that they both need to occur in the way that they did in order for the changes that occurred during the civil rights movement to have happened. If there wasn't a Malcolm, the things that MLK said and the Southerners wouldn't have been considered, like you said, because they didn't want it Malcolm's way. Yeah, and if there wasn't a Malcolm, there would be no comparison for whites to even think, oh, blacks are like that. I think they're used to seeing black people in history be like the Southerners.
Yeah.
And then Malcolm came in swinging, and they were like, oh, so you can do that too. We don't want that.
I agree with you that all the variables were needed, but I think the variables that were achieved were the ones that weren't Malcolm's, and that's why we're still where we are. I think if Malcolm's actual wants were executed, we'd be in a different state versus MLK's wants being actually put into practice, like giving us the right to sit at the table versus giving us a table.
Right.
So
I think they are different in a sense that, and this is obviously from an outsider perspective, not being black, mm-hmm. But I feel like just based on, if we were in a debate and it was a debate between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, it would be easy to see that the broader conversation is unified.
Yeah.
But the details of the conversation, the devil is in the details. So
precisely.
Each person in the way that they approach it are looking for the same thing, but
I actually don't think they were looking. I think that was the issue.
No, I mean in a broader sense, they are looking for the same thing.
They want equality, but the method that each is asking for it will derive different levels of it. And I think, as I was saying, the details would derive different results, and I think that's ultimately where you get Martin's realization. And I think that is the most important part of what he said before he died was, I fear I led you into a burning house. And I think that's exactly what Malcolm was trying to avoid. He was trying to say, let's get our own house, because that house is a piece of shit.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly, and that's why we're here.
MLK wanted to be invited in, and Malcolm wanted the land to build his own house.
Promised. He wanted the justice. He wanted the justice that was promised. Yeah. We built this, here's your 40 acres and a mule. And he wasn't willing to waver on that. And he knew how to express why he had no reason and he had every right to not waver on that. But yeah, move on to the next topic.
An abrupt stop, but still related topic.
Indeed.
Which is both of us have been experiencing an increase in, I guess, our friends reaching out to us about our opinions on what's going on right now with race and Black Lives Matter and every sort of social issue that's arising from race, the conversation of race.
From the precondition of racism.
Yeah. Like, personally, I've had a lot of friends reach out to me and talk to me about how they've had to kind of almost realize where they stand, because it's everything, all the media that's going on right now is forcing them to look at themselves and be like, I'm
that bitch.
Am I ignorant?
I'm Karen.
Am I the same? And these are all, I don't really have any white friends except for my few white friends, but most of my friends are colored. Most of my friends are Asian. So a lot of the conversations I have are around how Asians, especially our immigrant parents, how we can support, or why we should even support, or where we sit with our own culture in this narrative. Even though it's not about us, we still need to come to terms with that. And I feel like there are a lot of Asians and other people of color who need to come to terms with how they feel about their color and how they feel about their culture and race in order to understand why solidarity in this sense makes sense and why it is, as you said with Ronnie Chang, skin in the game.
Like for me, I feel like in the Americas, there's always the dichotomy of black and white. And then when every immigrant comes in, it's like they're given the blue pill or the red pill. You're coming on this side, you're going on this side. And when you pick a side, it's like, I'm fighting for that side and that's it. Yeah. And like, that's something that I've always noticed as being a black person who had interest in everybody's culture, just in general, I could always tell when you could qualify this characterization or not, but like you could tell when an Asian person was a white Asian person or a colored Asian person. You could tell when a Middle Eastern person was, oh, I'm only dating Tyler, or I'll date you too, Tyrone. Like you could always tell.
Yeah.
Dating habits always showed me the most. Like let me know when, yeah, they see me as a nigger. And I know they don't gotta say it, but when they're with Tyler, like, and Tyler makes a joke about black people, they're giggling the hardest. Like
I feel like that
you could
is
tell that demographic.
I feel like what you just stated in the context of dating, it's one of the best ways to explain the sort of like it's almost like the first step in understanding your ignorance as a colored person.
Who you choose to date.
Yeah, because a lot of people will say like to me maybe, "Oh, you're only into black guys because my partner is black." But this is the only black partner that I've had for this long of a time. Like so to judge the fetishizing of a culture is difficult because we do. I believe that what makes you attractive is your blackness. It's not the only reason why I'm attracted to you, but I'm attracted to color. So for me, there are friends that I have that are attracted to white people. I'm not that person. It's much more difficult for me to be attracted to a white male or a white female to find white people attractive because my preference is for a color. Like I will just reach for a color more so. That's my personal preference. That's not anybody else's. But I'm still attracted to the features of those colors.
I'd say for me, I'm more attracted to the cultural features of colors.
Yeah.
It's not even a physical thing in that sense because I find beauty in all, but being a black male in North America, like it's kind of like a rite of passage of how you grew up. I'd say the black male bodies, their biggest value is sexual and labor. And when you enter your teens, you realize those values that the world has on you, and you kind of fulfill them and you give into to them. But along the way, through dating, something that I became very, very clear that it's impossible to be with somebody who cannot understand you culturally.
Yeah. And I think
Period.
And I think that's where the initial physical attraction of a culture, just the stereotypes that come with culture and the surface of physical features that come with a culture and a race.
Similar path.
That's the initial pull because that's all we really have. We didn't know each other. But in learning each other, there's so much connectivity in the differences in our cultures and
the opposition to other.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a unified, like it's an automatic unification because our values align in terms of our cultural backgrounds. Like we both will not wear our shoes in the house. We both will there are certain things.
Not let dogs lick you in the face.
We won't there's certain things that you just don't do. And when I grew up, that was associated with white people. Well, that's a white thing. That's what white people do. And then I meet you, or I meet other colors in general, and they're like,
fuck that nasty shit.
It's an unwritten thing though. You just agree on. You just know you grew up with. So automatically, I'm already culturally still diverse, but still connected. And that's the reason why it's not an active reason why I don't seek out Asians as a partner. That's not it. It's just that some of the things that are within my culture also don't connect with me. They're also not attracted to me. Like I wasn't a model Asian, you could say, growing up. And so most Asian parents look at me and they're like, not
Keep
for my son.
Away. Yeah,
no.
Actually, I speak on that. Like there's being black and quote unquote blurry where I was interested in like taking apart electronics and rebuilding them or building studios or nerding out on like hardware or like just general things that weren't, or my favorite pastime, playing hockey, or me and my mother put us in baseball. So we weren't in football and basketball. So that right there put me in a space where I wasn't exclusively with people that looked like me. I went to a French school for the first 4 years of my life. So I wasn't with people who were Anglophone and or black. So as a result of that, I think a lot of my friends growing up, even my white friends, in an ignorant way would always say, oh, you're a white guy. You're just like white people. And I think what this past week has shown me, and maybe my friends, or they will realize it after hearing me state it this way. When you're a black person who's on the edge of blackness and looking over into whiteness, if anything, it is the most black experience because you have both sides, the black side and the white side, telling you what you're not. And it makes you realize everything that you are and what actually is valuable to you. Like, I think I probably stand up the most to racial inequality out of my friends, but I get called the whitest by my black friend. Like, I'll be the first one to call a spade, or speak on behalf of black people, or use my business to employ black youth, or do business with only people of color. But my white friends will just see, oh, he chose to do music over gym, and he plays hockey, and he speaks properly. He's a white boy. But in reality, in my eyes, I'm probably more black in the sense of my values and the things that I promote and things that I do to advance blackness than they could even measure up to. But that can't be seen. But I think in moments like this, the phone calls and me sharing what my black experience is, it kind of makes them realize that if anything, I'm the guy who's going to be right there with you on that line for blackness, not the opposite.
Yeah. I think that's also like pretty similar to when I was growing up. I didn't really identify with Asians necessarily. Like I grew up with a lot of Filipinos. My mom's Filipino, so there's a certain there are very stereotypical things that Filipino families engage in and Filipino youth grow up with, and I could only really associate by but through my friends. Like it wasn't necessarily that I did it in my family, but I would do it with my friends in their family. So that's how I could identify with other Filipinos. For the most part, I didn't have that same sense of culture, quote unquote, like they did in their families because I wasn't engulfed in it. Like my dad wasn't around, and my dad's not Filipino. My dad's Thai. I wasn't engulfed in Thai culture or Filipino culture, but more so Filipino culture than anything else. So I had to figure out what culture I was myself. I was like, what kind of Asian do I want to be? Like, am I going to be this or this or that? But I always knew that it wasn't white. However, lots of people, because I didn't identify with a particular Asian, because I was different Asians and didn't have a total, I've got to be white. So even if I like quote unquote white music, which sometimes wasn't white music, but people just associated it with that.
Blonde tips, and I played a bass, and I was in a band called Crate.
I liked Korn.
Yeah, I still fuck with Korn. I think we grew up as what our parents wanted, which was Canadian kids, which is what they struggle and strive to get here for. And I think we're exactly what we're supposed to be. And you're only enriched if you have multiple perspectives. It doesn't eliminate a perspective when you acquire a new one. It enriches you. And if anything, it can consolidate what you did well, and it can maybe make you remove some things that weren't well. Like, I'll use an example for me. Like growing up, my mother had both my parents had a lot of self-hate that was ingrained in them through being black people in North America. Like, my mother would tell me, oh, your hair looks so niggerish, cut it off. Or my dad would always be very proud if I had a white girl come home, but didn't care if it was anything else. Like, he saw the status in their white skin. My mother saw the detriment in my black hair. And I think when you're interacting with other cultures, like a lot of people would always tell me, oh, I love your hair. It's very, very nice. Or just being appreciative of my skin tone, whereas I was taught that it wasn't good in many ways. I think my parents achieved their goal of having a Canadian kid who thinks he can do anything that he wants. And yeah.
That was very different for me growing up. I didn't really have interestingly, race wasn't necessarily a thing because I predominantly just grew up with my mom. Even my sisters are quite a lot older than me, so they were out of the house and doing their own thing for a long time. So my education in race really had to come from myself, being able to engage with people from other races and try to figure out what my own race narrative is. So I think it's interesting now to have a lot of friends who were comfortable and had race narratives when they were growing up, maybe at times they were clashing because they wanted to listen to white music or rebel against their family and do white things, because that's generally the narrative that we had. If you were going to rebel against your family, you were going to go do white things.
You're gonna get fucked up, mom.
That was more so the case. Where I think it's surprising now, or I guess it's an interesting observation to see that where I sit now, I'm more racially conscious of everything. I'm more open to having conversations about race. It's comfortable to me. I think for us being in a biracial relationship, we can have comfortable conversations about race.
We can have comfortable conversations about everything because we're not feeling like this isn't a passive attack in some way
Yeah.
on our existence.
Yeah, and a lot of the times that comes with race. When you are obviously not the same color, it's easy to go to race right away, but we tend to start with like inherent values.
What's the issue?
Yeah, like an objective, non-biased, non-racial approach to the actual issue at hand. Whereas I would, and this is probably my own vice, but if I was in a relationship with a white person, that's where I would normally go, because the culture, I mean, the value connection isn't there.
And also it's so systemically oppressive, and the stench of it is so apparent in your own face that it takes restraint sometimes to not devolve into that with them, because you realize for them it's just a trigger to put up walls, even though it shouldn't be the case. But they are so ignorant to the circumstances of other that to them it's just, I feel attacked.
And then if you do bring it up, oh, why is everything all about race with you?
Why are you attacking me?
Whiteness. Or something like that. Why? Yeah. So it's harder to have those conversations. And I'm not saying all white people are like this, because there are definitely people, especially in my family, both my sisters have white partners who are open to having those conversations, who are sincerely like, yeah, I am ignorant and I want to listen. And they start with a listening ear versus a defensive argument or trying to formalize anything. They're not trying to formalize opinions. They're trying to listen and understand. Yeah. And like my older sister is a lot more vocal about race than I am. That's where I learned it. And her partner is very much like, okay, yeah, I'm going to listen. Yep. Like willing to have those conversations and listen, and is generally a good-hearted person. So I think that's also an interesting thing too, to separate. There's a big chunk of white people who are maliciously racist. There's malice behind their ignorance. There's a large chunk of white people who are ignorant with no malice. Ignorant because of just how they grew up.
Privilege. That they don't understand.
But maybe unwilling to understand. And then there's like third category, I'm ignorant, I'm aware, and I wanna become better. And I want to listen, like become better in a sense of better support for colored people.
I think that's the last thing that I would touch on with dating is, not to just single in on dating like a black-white narrative or a yellow-white narrative or a brown-white narrative, but whenever white is the other side of the equation, be very, very conscious when you do get into those serious discussions that need to be addressed, whether or not they're trying to understand you or trying to get past it with you. Because one is going to grow your relationship, the other is going to pacify it. And they're trying to calm you to make you manageable again, to make you a better you people. In a sense, they're trying to fit you into the picture that they have of you in their head. It's like what it is.
It's like the difference between, let's say there's a place you want to go on a road trip on a map, and you're in the car with that person. They want to pass it, but you want to get out, look around, enjoy it. But they're just like, okay. Well, we'll go and then we'll get it over. That's not the case.
You can't build with that.
You want to make sure that you're in a relationship, and this is outside of color too, because this can happen in biracial relationships that don't include white people, is that whatever relationships don't serve your values are not for you. And that goes across whether that's your partner, whether that's your friend, whether that's your coworker, whatever it is. If the values don't serve you, that relationship is not worth you exhausting yourself to try and come to some even plane, because it's inherently not there.
If your relationship takes more out of you than it puts into you, that's the only equation that you need.
Yeah. And sometimes that means having these conversations where you're trying, the goal is to understand, and the goal is to support, and the goal is to peel back ignorance before that white person It might just be the goal is to understand and move on. But there's no moving on from the color of your skin or the narrative that you live out every day, because it's going to continue to live out. So that's treading caution and being able to identify. Like, we're not saying break up with your white partner. That's not what we're saying. We're saying
be aware of your environment.
Yeah.
And really analyze whether or not it's building you up or if it's covering you.
Yeah. Because it's one thing to go on a journey on your own and peel back your own ignorance, but it's another to do it with another person who's there with you and is not supportive of that.
Yeah.
If they're not willing to create a safe space for you to admit your ignorance, that's the same thing. Like, if I wasn't sensitive to the Black narrative, and if I was unwilling to learn, if I was unwilling to watch every single movie in the Roots series, or every other movie about Black culture and every other slave movie, whatever it is, if I was unwilling, if I was like, oh, not another slave movie.
Fuck you then. I'm gonna watch.
Honestly, it would be way more difficult. I wouldn't be serving that purpose. I wouldn't be serving you in your journey, understanding your own narrative, and then myself having to understand how I can be an ally, a support system, a good partner, because that all is the same thing as any relationship you would have with any other person in life.
The reveal of the title for this week was Lock It, Snap It, Break It Off. This harkens back to a stand-up bit by Martin Lawrence, where he was talking about if he was ever in jail, he wouldn't idly take being screwed over. So to tie it to current climate of systemic oppression, when they're trying to fuck you over, lock it, snap it, break it off. Fuck them. Till next week.